Thank you very much. So today we have a panel talking about how to work with human rights in the European Union. And we have a great panel, guest on the panel. We have Soraya Post, the member of European Parliament, the first elected representative from a feminist party to be elected to any parliament in the European Union. Soraya belongs to the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. This is a political group of all of the Social Democrats in the European Parliament. Soraya is on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, where she's the coordinator, and she's on the Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs Committee. Soraya also co-founded the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup, which I coordinate. So Soraya is also my boss, so I'll be easy on you, Soraya, today.
Thank you.
And then the second panelist we have is Morten Kjaerum, who used to be the director of the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency and is now the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, based in Lund, if I'm correct. Yep. And our third panelist is Mattias Gardell, director of the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies on Racism at Uppsala University. And Mattias has been a strong advocate, against racism and discrimination, both in Sweden and in the European Union. And our final panelist is an activist who's based in Brussels, Anna Robinson. She's a board member of IGLYO, the International Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Intersex youth organization. And the purpose of today's panel is to talk about human rights and fundamental rights in the European Union. But we want to kind of make the panel very interactive, so we will be asking the audience a lot of questions. We hope you will also take part in the debate and find it interesting. I will do a quick introduction of myself, which I forgot. I'm the coordinator of the European Parliament's Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. I lead in the European Parliament on all policies against racism, specifically on Roma, on Muslims, on Jewish people, on Black Europeans, on LGBTI, on gender and disability. And my intergroup, which is a formation of different members of parliament from across the political spectrum, come together to look at these issues and also look at intersectionality. And we'll be talking about that as we go on. Before we start, you can join the conversation at #HumanRights. You can also tweet at the different panelists and participants, which is at the bottom. And we will split the panel into three themes. The first is, what is the EU and what does the EU do? The second is, what are the challenges and threats to democracy, rule of law, and human rights? And the final part is, what are the solutions? And before I go to the panelists, I want to see if anyone in the audience wants to tackle the first question. What is the EU and what does the EU do? Is there anyone who wants to have a go at answering that? Anyone? There must be someone here who wants to answer that. Okay, I guess there's no one here right now. So I'm going to take my place on the panel and ask the panelists what they think. So let's start with Morten. You've been the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency. Now you head the prestigious Raoul Wallenberg Institute. What is the EU in your eyes? What do you think the EU does? And how can the EU be relevant to people in the audience, but people in society?
Thank you very much. In short, I think EU is the biggest peace project that the world ever has seen. And not only that, it's also the most successful peace project ever seen. I must say I was extremely proud working with the Fundamental Rights Agency when the European Union received the Nobel Peace Prize. And when that is said, we of course also know that a lot of things are not working very well. I mean, just mention refugees, discrimination, and things I'm sure we will get back to. But overall, we should not forget that the EU was all about creating stability and sort of absence of conflict, peace in Europe. And I think we have succeeded so far, but I'm deeply worried about the direction that we are now moving.
So if we follow on from that, the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize. The EU was set up to, after decades and centuries of war between EU member states. But today, I think for a lot of people in the audience, but a lot of people in society, they would think that, we're at a stage in the European Union and in Europe where we're going back to, let's say, 1934. Our societies are deeply divided. We see the rising number of newly arrived people from different countries. We see existing communities in vulnerable situations see that their situation is getting worse and worse. So, Mattias, how would you see that, and what do you see is happening right now? How much of a threat are we living in today?
Now, I think we live in quite dangerous times. Fascism is returning to Europe and has become normalized to such an extent that it's not always recognized as fascism if it doesn't come dressed in the uniforms that our Hollywood experience has learned us to identify as fascists. What they have in common today is very often monoculturalism, the idea that social harmony depends on that its citizens are of the same feather, which again, of course, goes directly against everything we know about mankind and our societies, which at all times and all places has been known for its heterogeneity and not homogeneity. And this is very dangerous, and I think that what we see today also is that these basic questions has come to the fore. What is Europe? What is the meaning of being European? Who belongs to Europe? Who should be excluded from Europe, said not to belong here? And with this rising tide of new radical nationalist monocultural parties, even though they are typically EU skeptics, they have pushed these questions again to the forefront. Look at Europe. In Greek ancient mythology, Europe was a Phoenician princess born in what today is Lebanon, brought to Crete by the god Zeus. If that had been today, Europe had been excluded from Europe. She would have been branded an illegal immigrant. Zeus had been chased by Frontex as a smuggler, as a human trafficker. And we have these questions that again question the right of existence to so many people that has belonged to Europe way before Europe became Europe. Look at, for instance, they talk about Muslims who have been part of and creators of the history we called European for more than 1,300 years. Islam has been one of Europe's many religions for as long, but they are now construed as being alien or foreign to Europe. Look at the history of the Roma people, who have been on the continent for thousands of years. That has been, and that's a part of the hidden history of Europe too, the history of the Roma slavery. We know a lot about the transatlantic slavery, we know a lot about black slavery in the New World, but we know so little about the European slavery that enslaved the Roma people, that began before the transatlantic slavery and then after the slavery was abolished in the New World, and was centered in the same countries that now face such a tremendous exclusion of Roma people that they are forced to leave Romania and Bulgaria, enter into the remaining parts of the European Union countries, and are now chased from place to place with exactly the same techniques and legitimation strategies as when anti-Roma racism was at its apex in the 20s and 30s. Look at the Jewish people, who also have been present in Europe for as long time, for more than a millennia, right? But they are now suddenly also construed as being alien, a threat to something other than European.
And so we see this threat, and we look at Europe's history, and those of us who have looked at Europe's history, we understand the contribution that many of these groups who are now under attack in Europe have contributed to Europe. So Soraya, you're a member of parliament in the European Parliament. You're half Jewish, half Roma. Your own family and ancestors suffered in the Holocaust. You've just authored the landmark report in the European Parliament on the fundamental rights of Roma in the European Union. But how do you see it from your seat in Brussels, in the European Parliament? The European Parliament has many far-right populist political parties, ranging from different levels of the spectrum on the right. But how do you find it as a feminist, as someone who's Roma, who's Jewish, and one of the strongest anti-racist voices in the Parliament?
Thank you, Alfiaz, and thank you to the audience. I am pleased that you chose to come here because I think it is important from an EU perspective, even though we are in Sweden and the Human Rights Days in Sweden, because Sweden is not an isolated island. We are connected to the EU. That's why I thought it was important that we have this discussion here, because what is decided in the EU, like 60-70% has an effect on our daily life also in Sweden. And when it comes to and this phenomenon which we are speaking about, the how the political arena is looking today, has, of course, a big effect on our extreme forces here, because they are more organized and more allied across the European Union than we as anti-racists are, I must say. So, but being a parliamentarian in the European Parliament, I love to be there. And I love the arena. I was EU skeptic before. I would never have voted for an EU from the beginning. But as more I stay there, I can see it as a platform to make a change. So the position as a politician, as a feminist, I just want to say there is a need for more feminists in the European Parliament.
I think so.
So please run for election as politicians, because we are really needed there. And the fact that we are making a difference in the European Parliament. Yes, we did see, when I entered 2014, we could see there were 6 political groups with all the resources, what comes to it. During, I think it was a year and a half or maybe 2 years, we had another political group created by Marine Le Pen and the others, ENF, and others who were extreme rights, which meant that they got more speaking time, more economic resources, and got more allied, which meant that they will become a stronger force. So, which affect speaking times. And they are so smart, because they use their speaking time and recording it and spread and have the chance to spread the propaganda, because they are legitimized to be in the most democratic forum. And there they have their speeches. And record it and spread it. And they use also the other tools inside the European Parliament to manifest their kind of political agenda, which is not that very easy. We have strategies, and I did, but it was also because I am a clear anti-racist. In the Parliament, when we had debates, you have the possibility to raise a blue card, to put a question on if I have a speech. Somebody else can put a blue card on me and ask if I would like to answer the question. And of course, the extreme rights want to put blue card on me. But I said no. And this was not common in the Parliament. So I raised a new custom in the Parliament that if you don't want to speak with them or give them more time to record or space to spread their message, just deny it. So in the Social Democratic Political Group and in GUE, the Left Group, and also in the Green, we have decided, we had a common strategy. When they ask, we don't want to answer, because we noticed that they use the time to spread even more. And as I said, at that time it was Swedish Democrat Kristina Winberg who wanted to put a question on me, and I said, no, I don't take it, because she has nothing to put into the discussion. So that became a common rule. But it is a platform. And for me, working strongly on human rights, on anti-racism, and to develop feminist mindset, it is an excellent platform. We can reach out. And then it also depends on what you're doing during the mandate you are there. Like me, together with Gudrun Schymer, who is the party leader for Feminist Initiative, we go out to member countries, gather in the LGBTI movement, anti-racist movement, and women movement, and try them to get the kind of feministic analysis that we have. So, because my dream is, of course, that there will be another political group, a feministic political group in the parliament who has that power and that resources which is in need. But I also would like to say, Europe, yes. Europe has a history of xenophobia, and Europe is still a xenophobic continent. And as long as we don't deal with that, we will always have these kind of arises. And we can also see that they already changed the language in the parliament. Yeah.
And so, to the audience, I want to give a little bit of background. The reason why we start like this is to show, what is the EU, but what are the problems facing the EU. And the idea is to see, as Soraya, as the other panelists have put forward, that in Brussels, at the European Union level, we can do a lot. But we have to start to understand that the European Union, regardless of what national politicians or national political parties say about the European Union, it is a place where you have democratic debate, where legislation and policies are made. When I think of anti-racism, I look at the European Union, which has pure competence to make legislation and policies on anti-racism, the Race Equality Directive, the Employment Equality Directive, the Council decision on, framework decision on racism and xenophobia. And I think what we want to stress is that there is so much potential that we can do at the European Union level, but first of all, we have to take it seriously. We also have to understand that our opponents, the other political forces on the right, are using this forum, are using the budget, the economic resources, the political resources available to build a movement. And I think this is where we could probably come to you, Anna, that you represent IGLYO, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans Youth Organization. And how important is it that we build these coalitions, that we bring together anti-racist, feminist, LGBTI together? How difficult is it to do, given that sometimes we have different positions in the way we see society, but how important is it that we work together to counter some of the problems that have been mentioned previously?
It's incredibly important, and I think it's the key to moving forward. And I think what we're seeing is a shrinking space for civil society. We're seeing a lack of funding, we're seeing lack of support, and we're also seeing division in civil society. And what the right-wing populists are doing are trying to break us apart. So there's discourses from the right wing of people who've never really cared about feminism, but they're mobilizing discourses of feminism in order to propagate Islamophobia or anti-migrant hatred. And what we need to do as activists is to bring people together and say, we are Europeans, we're migrants, we're asylum seekers, and we are actually the majority. We are not the minorities. We can work together, and these voices, we can amplify each other. And so we need to show solidarity and allyship and understand that we have intersectional identities. So there are people with disabilities who are migrants. There are queer people who are Muslims. And to work together to understand that these identities can bring us together, even when it can be difficult. And I think that's what we need to think about when we think about what is the EU and what can we do on the European level. It's to work together and use those links.
Soraya, you had something?
Yes, I would like to add. And in there, we have also the opportunity to give voice for the people who don't really have a place in there. So we're doing events, like I have invited disabled women. I have invited Muslim women for the first time in the parliament to to show the other parliamentarian, this is how a society looks, and these people is under our competence. We have to make decisions that give them a better future, to give them a voice and a chance to live their own potential how they want it. Not all the time just to stay outside and to be afraid and hope that somebody will take care. I mean, there is a lot of lobbyists in Brussels, like for alcohol or bicycles or, you know, name it. But for me as a human, for me it's most important is to give people the voice, to spread their voices, not as weak groups, just to show the weak structure we are living our lives in. That is important.
And Morten?
I would say one of the strengths of the EU that we need to explore much more and be much more aware of, and that is the tremendous networking possibilities that we have. I mean, of course, in the European Parliament, it's obvious, it's there. I mean, parliamentarians from all over Europe meet, they discuss, they in a way converge on a number of issues, also definitely on the extreme right wing for sure. But we also see we have 40 agencies, and I was heading one of them. And if I take that little agency that was in Vienna, the Fundamental Rights Agency, what did I have? I had a civil society platform with 400 civil society organizations that met on a very regular basis. I had all the national parliaments, the speakers of the parliament or the secretariats or whatever, meeting also on discussing human rights issues. I had academia, I had national human rights institutions from all 28 member states. So just that one agency out of the 40 agencies. And I think we were sort of conscious about that potential of creating a stronger European dialogue. I think a lot of other actors and other agencies and institutions in the EU could use it much more explicit and be aware of that possibility, because that's where we create the European discourse and a European understanding on a number of these topics. And we are simply not good enough with that.
So if we're not good enough at that, then you outline one stakeholder there, which is academia. So Mattias, how can academia shape the discourse and the discussion in the European Union? You're based at the University of Uppsala. Mm-hmm. You're leading this multidisciplinary center against racism. But what can academia do more specifically to contribute in this fight against racism, against discrimination, and also with the European institutions?
I think that racism needs to be fought on many very different levels. One of them is, of course, with knowledge. What our center and other racism scholars can contribute with is to produce empirically sound knowledge about racism and discrimination. Racism is a topic that is so highly emotionally charged. If you talk about racism, lots of people start to feel things and they get angry and they talk a lot, but very rarely with reference to empirical fact. And of course, we also know that that in itself will not solve the problem, because fascism does not only refer to empirical reality to favor the cause. It's a lot about emotions and affections and spirit and images and visions. So I think also that one level that, and I hope that the Center of Multidisciplinary Studies of Racism, which is the first in Swedish university history, and is quite unique in the world as well, globally. I hope that this will inspire other scholars in all the various European countries to come together and form research centers that could act as a resource to politicians, to civil society organizations, and work together. I think that would be an important contribution as well, of course. But I think that one thing that needs to be done is to counter the fascist vision, because they have a vision. And I think a lot of other kinds of politicians now sort of don't really have visions anymore. It's like we arrived, it's gonna stay like this. We have been, as Fukuyama said, at the end of history, the last man, that we cannot really imagine another world as possible, accept this world, and hence we abandon the idea of visions, of images, of utopias, of a better world to the fascists who produce all these visions. We know that this vision could not be translated into concrete policy without violence and bloodshed, and it will not last. We all know that. But I would like to see a vision of a better Europe. I want to see visions of a Europe in which actually human rights not only is a slogan, but a manifest reality that centers on human dignity. And I think that we need to solve some problems, for instance, anti-Roma racism and exclusion. We cannot have a situation in which 9 to 16 million Roma people still live in exclusion, still face this blatant, fully visible to everybody is announced anti-Roma policies in all European countries and still talk about human rights, because then you have too big of a discrepancy between the idea of what we tell everyone that we are and the concrete social reality as experienced and observed. So I think that is another challenge that we need to confront.
And this vision, so to bring it back to the EU, when I look at the EU and I look at what the EU can do, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. But with the Lisbon Treaty at the European Union level, we had the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which goes far beyond any other human rights instrument anywhere in the world. It gives protections in terms of labor, in the economy, on sexual orientation, on gender, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't do. So we see the European Union creating this vision. We see it working at the European level. I see how forward-thinking the European Commission is in comparison to member states. I still don't think the European Commission is forward-thinking enough, but when you compare it to member states, and even the most progressive member states, the European Union is far further advanced in terms of promoting and protecting fundamental rights, and especially of those who are the most in need, those communities in the most vulnerable situation. And so this vision is there, and it's been articulated, but how do we implement this vision? And before I come to the panel, I wanted to see if anyone in the audience has any particular perspectives on what has been said. This time around, do we have any questions from the audience or any comments? Someone? No? Okay. So we have this vision, but how do we implement this vision? And for me, I think it's about representation, about having representation of people from various backgrounds who can articulate the concerns of their community, but also to have those who are silent right now, who belong to the majority population, to get them to come and speak out. And when my friends tell me, you work in the European Parliament, you have these neo-Nazis, these homophobes, these anti-feminists in the Parliament, I say to them, well, the fact that I'm sitting there working in the Parliament, a son of refugees from Uganda in the 70s, a gay Muslim man, I tick all of the boxes that the fascists, the racists hate. They don't want me in the building, but yet I'm there and contributing to the debate. So how important is it to have representation? But in your own lines of work, when we see minorities represented, what kind of change do we see? And I think here, maybe I'll go to you, Soraya, first. You are very vocal on the issue of Roma amongst other communities. You've just authored this landmark report, the first time anti-Gypsyism has been defined, the fact that the Roma Holocaust has been recognized at the European Union level. How important has it been that you, a Roma feminist woman, working in the European Parliament, how much of a difference does it make?
I think it makes a huge difference because I have an experience, so I know what I speak about. And as you said, I'm quite vocal because I don't have anything to lose. And I want all these people to understand the situation of so many other people. So, and when, I mean, I was a human rights activist, I'm still an activist, for 40 years, working on, and I have established International Roma Women Network, European Roma Traveler Forum, international organizations. And for me, and with the mandate from my political party, it was because we are based on human rights, feminist that is based on human rights, on human dignity for all. So it was quite clear for me to start with the Roma group because it is still, in fact, the most and biggest marginalized group in Europe today. And even if countries out of the 28 are worse and some are better, it's still not good enough in any of the countries. So for me it was important to have a definition and a recognition, mostly a recognition that anti-Gypsyism is a specific form of racism towards Roma, which has centuries of history behind, which leads to the effects of discrimination, social exclusion, bad housing, no work, all this. So it was important for me to create like a platform and a recognition. So in 2015, when we had the first resolution adopted with a huge majority, recognizing anti-Gypsyism, the definition, and also the Holocaust of Roma, which have been, and still are in some parts denied. So it was important. I mean, the first time any person in a position at high level ever spoke about the Roma Holocaust was in 1981 by Helmut Schmidt in Germany. So, and I mean, the year of 2000, we got a Barak house in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And 2012, we got a memorial place in Berlin. Very beautiful. But this is almost 17 years after this crime. And for me, it also was very important to have the word, the terminology of Roma Holocaust. There was a huge resistance towards this. First, I wanted the Roma name for it. No chance at all. Okay. And then Holocaust, because in the word of Holocaust, everybody knows the perpetrator, they know which time it was, you know, everything is explained, and it's also recognized by the UN for all victims. But there, as I said, there was resistance. So, and then finally I said, okay, they want a genocide. So in the title it says genocide, but the most important part, it says Holocaust. And I said, no, okay, then I don't do this report. So we don't do the resolution. Because I cannot accept two definitions of the same crime, the same time, the same perpetrators. I couldn't, no. So finally, I got it. So, which created a platform for me to go further, how to work towards this. So now, in 25th of October, I made this report, initiative report, which also was adopted with a huge majority together with the shadows. We worked it out. And I have, in the resolution, 12 pages is of proposals and recommendations towards the EU, to the Commission, to the Council, and to the Member States. So they have work to do. And of course, I'm very happy for it. And I'm very happy that so many Roma and other NGOs have this paper to work about. And I just want to say, can I say a few?
You can say something.
Yeah, because as I said, 12 pages of demands, it's quite much. But I go for big, because maybe they will give less, but truly it went through, so I am very happy for that. The first one, which I think is very important, is the demand of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at member states, but also at EU level. Because if we don't deal with the root cause, and try to create trust between the groups. We can do projects, we can do programs, whatever, but if we don't have that trust between minority and majority, it won't be successful. So there is a need, and we have seen, I mean, when I was in a committee on Roma issue in Sweden, we invited minister from Canada, because they did just have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee on the First Nation. So I spoke also with them at that time, and I knew how it went out, Maybe not perfect, but anyhow, it's a good start. So that was my vision. And also here in Sweden, we have this white book. And I know how much it did empower the Roma people in Sweden, having this white book, because it showed that everything we had said was not lies. They could see. And I remember the minister at the time, Ullenhag, he said, everything you have mentioned is here, and it's true, everything. Yes, it is. So that fact was very important. And another issue, just to mention a few, is that we deplore the violation of the right of Roma to free movement. So what I mean is there is a conscious anti-gypsies, but there is also an unconscious, because if somebody don't exist, they are not included in the mindsetting when we put policies. So it was very, and of course participation, meaningful. And then I also have a demand to the Court of Auditors to check the performance of EU programs. Because these programs and the money put to this program are also used by the extreme rights. So and so much money is spent on Roma. But the fact is that this money never reach their target. They never do anything for the target. They disappear in the way, during the way, or other pockets, I don't know. So I ask for them to have a better check on what are done with the money. And of course, monitoring mechanisms, etc., etc. As I said, 12 pages. And also I asked that Roma women who were forced sterilized for compensation. A lot.
So you have these recommendations. Morten, you were the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency. The Fundamental Rights Agency, if people don't know it, is an agency of the European Union to monitor fundamental rights in the European Union. The Fundamental Rights Agency puts out an annual report on fundamental rights, or biannual report on fundamental rights. When you were there as director, how important was it to have these reports, and how were these reports implemented? How were particular groups involved in the process of, contributing to the reports, both the scientific evidence, but also in terms of the practical kind of, discrimination that some of these communities face? And how effective do you think it is to have an agency like the Fundamental Rights Agency there to monitor what's happening in the European Union?
I think, not surprisingly, that it's extremely important to have such an agency. I think the most important piece of work that we did was that we contributed to moving the human rights agenda from being first and foremost normative, sort of say following the legal norms and standards, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but take one step further, namely say we need to know more. We need to have evidence. So we rolled out these very big surveys, first time ever done in Europe, on ethnic minorities, on LGBT, on Jewish community, on the Roma community, on violence against women. And I would postulate that they created new agendas. This was the first time when we really went out and asked people, how are you? How do you feel? And the answers that we got, I think, surprised most of us who had worked on these issues for very long, that the discrimination was so deep and it took place so many different places, in school, in hospitals, etc. And with all that data, we could go back to the relevant authorities, institutions, say, listen, you have a problem. You cannot claim that 25% of, or big number, thousands of ethnic minorities, LGBT people, lie. That's very often what you hear. Oh, they're probably not telling the truth. Or do you think it's all coordinated? Let me just give you one example where I think we really managed to move, and which I feel was very important. And that was in the field of hate crime. Hate crime, I don't know how many people know the concept, but it's basically where you are assaulted, beaten up, or whatever, because of whom you are. Not because you've done anything, but because of your skin color, sexual orientation, or what sort of the perpetrator believe you are. That has a tremendous impact, not only on the individual, but on the entire community. Because if this person is beaten up because of his or her skin color or sexual orientation, then maybe it's me next time. Even as nice as I treat everybody, It may just randomly be me. So there's an enormous fear factor here, which spreads in entire communities. And when you talk about building trust, hate crime is one of those features that really counter trust building. This issue was totally ignored, except from in the UK. UK has worked for many years very seriously on addressing hate crime. At the continent, including Sweden and all the way through, it has been almost totally ignored. Not entirely, but almost. It was a non-issue. And then suddenly we could put on the table that the ethnic minorities, the sexual minorities and others, Roma, had a very high percentage. When we asked them about hate crime, around 25% of the respondents said that within the last 12 months they had been assaulted because of whom they are. If we talk about transgender, we are up to a third of the transgender people. Then suddenly the ministers, the police, etc., that before had just pushed it under the carpet or ignored it or said, we don't have an issue. We asked the police and they say they had 50 cases. Or in 10 countries, there were 0 cases. And when you asked people what they had been confronted with, I mean, there should be many more. But we also heard that they do not report to the police because they don't trust the police. Again, coming back to the importance of trust. So all this was because of the evidence that we gathered. So I'm a firm believer also, as you said, we need to know more. But of course, it's not only about knowledge, it's also about reacting then on the knowledge, communicating that knowledge, getting the political traction. But let me just mention one more element which is also intimately linked to what we're discussing here, that we also were very conscious about at the agency, because it's very easy when we have a human rights agenda that we focus on the minorities. And we should, because it is, I mean, minorities are normally the most vulnerable and those most at, let's say, at risk of having human rights violations or be confronted with human rights violations. But we run the risk that human rights are seen as only for the minority. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have, that we need to sort of say show that there's something in it for everybody, also for the majority. And we have probably in the human rights movement, broadly speaking, not been good enough in addressing the concerns of, let's say, the marginalized Swedish men or women or whatever, and throughout Europe. And I must say, when I traveled through Europe for 7 years while I was director, starting in 2008, when the financial crisis came, we saw the anger growing, and we were calling in Brussels, in the parliament and elsewhere, saying we need to work on economic social rights for all those who are now out of school, losing their pensions, etc. If we ignore that, we are just giving a tremendous platform for extremism. But I must say we got some support in the parliament from certain groups, definitely not from all, but mostly there was a lack of understanding. And I think it's partly what we pay for now, that we need to be much better in addressing. Just to wind up on one example, now I mentioned the hate crime. Just give you one example. If you take a street, and I know one particular street in Denmark, but you can find similar streets in Sweden, where you from the one end to the other, may have up to 10, 12, 13 years difference in life expectancy. This is a modern Northern European welfare state where 12 years difference, these are those living here. 12 years, live 12 years shorter than those living here. These are Swedish, Danish men, poorly educated, single, etc., etc. Who were concerned about their issues? Very few. And this is sort of the agenda, the human rights agenda. We also need to develop, so to say, have a holistic approach to it.
And I think in the Parliament, in our work on that point, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we look at the wide tent approach. That, you know, diversity and inclusion is not about minorities. It's not about particular groups in society. Diversity and inclusion is about everyone in society. Bringing together, you know, those on income poverty, those who are homeless, those who are LGBTI, Muslims, Roma, migrants, refugees, all together to create a movement where all of their concerns are factored. Because all of these people, the people who have these discrepancies in life expectancy, they don't belong in the majority. If you take it in facts, these people aren't in the majority because they are also outsiders within the community, within society. So how do we bring them together? And I think to understand that, we have to understand what each other's problems are in society. So Soraya has articulated about Roma. You've articulated about, various different groups. But maybe I want to touch upon, some of the situation for some of the other groups in society. A little bit about Muslims, about refugees, Black Europeans. And I think we can start with LGBTI people. Anna, where do you see the situation for LGBTI people in Europe today? I see that in Lithuania, in Romania, we have referendums on banning gay marriage. We see across Europe the rise of homophobic parties that want to curtail back on our rights, on the rights of LGBTI people. But I also see the fact that, globally we see LGBTI rights under threat. We see that the US administration, the previous administration, which really pushed the rights of LGBTI people, is now being overturned by the current administration. How do we support LGBTI activists in Europe, and what is their situation?
I think over the last years we've seen a lot of progress when it comes to legal reforms, for example, same-sex marriage or civil partnerships, some adoption rights, but not across the board. And on a social level, as you mentioned, for example, transgender people face a lot of violence from police, from society, lacking in access to healthcare, lack of gender recognition, being able to change their legal gender identity. We see unnecessary surgeries on intersex babies. We see a lot of problems, even though the legal frameworks are in place. So that's why, working as civil society, we need to empower ourselves and each other, especially the most marginalized groups, to feel like they belong in the EU. They can use these tools because they're all of our tools, and we all should be able to access them and access the decision makers. And so a lot of what, for example, IGLYO is doing is trying to work with young people, because I think young people can feel like this is so big they can't access it, they don't understand how it works and how to get their voices heard. So we do capacity building for young people from diverse groups, bring them together and help them share experiences, and work with people who have been doing this for years to make them understand that they can claim their rights and they have to do it for themselves. And there are already the frameworks in place for them to demand from their governments and on the EU level that these are the demands that we deserve this, and it's already enshrined, so give them to us now.
Okay. This very well articulated in the sense of what is there, what's happening. We see that, for the LGBTI community, that, they face a lot of problems and a lot of discrimination. But there are also some very good steps. In certain countries, we see, the adoption of, equal rights and more rights for LGBTI people. Mattias, what would you say in regards to Muslims and to refugees and newly arrived people coming to Europe? What are the biggest concerns we're seeing in regards to them?
If you look at the issue of paperless people, for instance, there are so many now that they, would be equal sized as a mid-sized European country. And when you talk about fundamental rights, their existence also show one of the problems with the whole human rights discourse, because here you suddenly find this figure, this person, who lacks any rights except the right that she is entitled to by being born a human being, right? But confronted with that person, all those who talk about human rights suddenly evaporates and disappear. And so you have so many millions now of illegal, undocumented migrants composing important sections of the underclass, being exploited for their workforce, And what kind of rights do they have? What kind of representation do they have in the European Parliament? Where is these movements at? If you look at the situation for other groups, if you look at Muslim communities, for instance, we know that in many European countries, the situation is the same as, for instance, here in Sweden, that if you have a Muslim-sounding name, you will have a hard time finding a job that matches your qualifications in the competition in the labor market with people with a neutral or non-Muslim sounding name, which means that you will have to buy with low-income job, a low-status job, which means, again, that you will have a problem finding housing in the good address. You end up at the other end of that street. And they are collected in certain areas that becomes more and more stigmatized. And you have also a new sort of culturalization of the political, where suddenly you say that these stigmatized underclass areas in which Black, Muslim, and Roma people live, it is because they are Muslims, Blacks, or Roma that they have all these problems that this face. So I think that's a serious problem. I also think that when you talk about racism, you should also not maybe only focus on the more explicit radical nationalist or racist organizations and groups, but look at what's happening in the departments, in the police force. And we see there you have a shortage of empirical knowledge that really looks at how structural discrimination works, that looks take a hard look at the police force, for instance. Sometimes the police who should be protecting the citizens are those who commit hate crimes. But we lack sufficient empirical research that could establish this in a way that makes it possible for policymakers to act upon this knowledge, to try to implement strategies to counter that. If you could look at the situation for the Afro-European diaspora, it's the same. So we have these similar problems, and again, it is centered on these same communities that was part of Europe before Europe became Europe, but that excluded from being European and now construed as being aliens. And I sort of react when I hear the word xenophobia, because this is not xenophobic. This is not directed against strangers. This is directed against neighbors, at other Europeans. And you can also see another interesting and troubling aspect, that today when the radical nationalist agenda has risen to such an extent that it become normalized and also become part of the policies in various countries where these parties now gain power. Look at Hungary, look at the Czech Republic, look at what happened in Poland and so on. You will see that people who are most directly targeted by violence and discriminations, they turn inward. They react by turning inwards. So suddenly you have Jewish people talking to other Jewish people, Roma with Roma, Muslims with Roma, Muslims with other Muslims, Afro-Europeans with other Black European citizens. And I can understand that, because it feels good that it's good to discuss your problems without having to explain everything, that you share a body of experiences. But you need then to also not only turn inwards and creating safe spaces and all of these things, but you need to connect, cross those bridges and start communicating across all these levels of identities in order to confront a problem that actually has a lot of similarities. And that's another challenge that we face today. How do we create new languages that makes it possible to communicate particular sufferings to others who are not perhaps Black or Muslim or Roma, so that they will be able to understand this? And how could we then, by this new language, maybe produce a vision of another Europe where equal rights and dignity for all is more than a slogan.
And I think, Morten, you had something on police, on authorities?
Yeah, and on the undocumented, because I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think it's what we have in relation to the undocumented is the biggest hypocrisy in Europe. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, think about how much politicians today stand up and say, oh, well, we should close borders, we cannot take more. And at the same time, they are totally open to receive irregular migrants to the labor market. Constantly we see across Europe, also Sweden, Denmark and other places, how the labor market inspectors and other mechanisms who should actually control these things are being cut. They're losing their tools to actually address it. So we have a wide open, as I say, market for extreme exploitation. I had a conversation with my colleague in Europol. We were sort of both in the agencies, and he shared my deep frustration about this. And that was why we at the Fundamental Rights Agency made a report that came out in 2015 about the extreme exploitation at the European labor market. We're talking about 3 to 4 million people in Europe living in this extreme exploitation. And I would claim that it's one of the strongest pull factors to Europe. It is that you have access to a labor market. So when we talk about, let's say that we should have immigration management and control, etc., and at the same time leave this open. I mean, it is really hypocrisy. But I want to sort of say just on one issue, you said that where's the human rights environment? I would actually claim that it is exactly the human rights environment and all the work that was done by the human rights environment that actually have contributed for that irregular migrants today, that there is a recognition that they have access to education, their children, access to basic health provisions, because in a number of states they were excluded from these basic rights, but it was because of the human rights movement, the Fundamental Rights Agency, but I would also point to one of the strongest networks in Europe, PICUM. I'm sure you know PICUM, which is a very, very strong NGO network addressing the situation for irregular migrants. So,
no, I agree. I was not referring to the human rights activists, but to because today we have this idea that political legitimacy is built on human rights, right? And democracy is built on the principle of human rights. And those who talk on that level about human rights, yes, look at that. So that was the reference.
So maybe, Soraya, you can quickly chip in, because I see that we haven't spoken that much about people with disabilities. And you've done a lot of work in the Parliament. So before we move on to the final part, if you could just quickly outline some of the concerns that you see in regards to people with disabilities.
Yes, because this is also a group that doesn't have that big voice in the Parliament. And I mean, I know in the European Parliament, out of 751 members, there might be known disability, maybe 5 members, which mean that they have a very low representation in the Parliament. And I'm also a member of the Disability Intergroup, and think, I mean, my purpose in the Parliament is to give floor and voice, space for people who don't have their voice in a natural way in these kind of arenas. So yes, I have been having some events and also highlighting another issue on violence against women with disability, which is so important and not so very much raised even by the traditional women organizations. So this is what I wanted to do, and we will continue doing that, of course. So yesterday I was at a seminar invited to My Rights, who just presented a report also on women with disabilities and the potential if they could be active in designing, implementing evaluation programs for them instead of with them. So we have to look for this with, and this is what I'm looking for, to find a space to work with people. And violence or interpersonal violence, I am now a rapporteur on a report on a European protection order, which will be voted out in November, I think. Anyhow, it is a directive, it is a law, it's legislation, and still, like last year, I think, or 2016 years, it was national protection orders, 114, and there were only 7 European protection orders, for example, which means there is not enough knowledge, there is not enough information spread for these people who are victims of perpetrators. So, and violence against women is not an issue on the EU's internal security agenda, which I am very shocked. So this is what I'm pushing for very strong, because we can look at external threats, etc., but the fact is that inside EU, every third woman, girl or woman, face insecurity on a daily basis, and it's not seen as a problem. So, which is shocking in 2017 that this is a fact. So I put a lot of efforts on that also, so I have that also. But I mean, when I speak about we will also have 2 big conferences on statelessness. I mean, there are 600,000 stateless people in Europe, in the European Union. So, which have no rights. They have no access to rights. And if I go back to the Roma again, who are not encountered in these 600,000, because when they did a study, they didn't include the Roma. And there are a lot of Roma who don't have identity papers and generations. And then an outcome from the Balkan War was that a lot of people ended up stateless. And now it's like 20, 30 years after, and they are still stateless without access to education or papers. So, of course, so in every policy document, and in every report, we are there, my office and me, we are there to put in amendments, to change the language, to include disability, LGBTI. So what we are doing, we are trying to put a feministic analysis in all the reports we can handle, and put our view in foreign affairs. And as you know, I am in the subcommittee on human rights. So, I mean, for me, it's a big issue what's happening in Myanmar, the Rohingyas. It is an ongoing genocide, and nobody's reacting because, and I was at the UN the other week, and so what are you doing? Yes, the Myanmar they don't want us there. Okay, they don't want you there. Of course they don't want you, because they want to finish their genocide. And the Bangladesh is, it's a very critical moment in that area. And so, yeah, we are trying to highlight all these issues because I will also be initiative reporter on another report in the Foreign Affairs Committee on conflict and peace building and mediation. So, of course, I will put a lot of efforts there, looking to this group who are not traditionally thought about. So, yeah, disability, it's a big issue, and yes, you can get sick and tired how we still don't have this in our mindset, how it is in here already. And it comes with the LGBT also. I mean, you know, I am a member in that intergroup also, and in the Social Democratic Group, for example, they didn't have any what's the name? Position paper on that issue. So that was one of the first jobs we did, to have in that political group, which I am in, that we should have at least a position paper, how we stand. Because when it comes to this issue, so everywhere we can, we put in amendments, and you know, Alfiaz, when there are hate speech in the parliament, or when Tajani didn't react to the hate speeches done towards me in the chamber. So, non-stop, we are trying, but we are very much in a need for the NGOs, the human rights activists, to get more knowledge inside.
And so, I think that leads us to it's a good starting point to the final part. What are the solutions? So we've outlined what the EU does. We've outlined concerns regarding various communities in the EU. Soraya, you've extended that to even talk about the Rohingya and other minorities outside of the EU. But what are the solutions? I go back to a conversation, Mattias, me and you had outside, and I mentioned briefly here, that when people tell me what is the biggest threat we're facing in the European Union, many of my counterparts in Brussels would say to me, Islamist radicalization. That is the biggest threat to Europe today.
What? I didn't hear.
Islamist radicalization. Radicalization and terrorism by Islamists. And I would say that come and sit or stand in my position. I would say the biggest threat we face today is populism and the far right.
And the silence.
And the silence. Not saying that Islamist or any radicalization or terrorism doesn't pose a threat. It does. And we see the effect it's had on our communities. Yeah. But for me, the biggest concern we're seeing today is the rise of populism and the far right. And actually, it's the populism and the far right, maybe this is a little bit controversial, but the populism and the far right that is leading to the social exclusion, leading to the fact that people from vulnerable communities would maybe go into or are, being, radicalized. So for me, if we want to solve the problem, the first thing we should be doing is solving the problem of the far right and of populism, looking at, how we can have better social inclusion, looking at how we can involve communities, and also looking at how we can better react to the extremism that's coming from the far right. And I would put it this way, that, it's not just the moral objective, the moral imperative that we all have to stand up for democracy, rule of law, human rights, our fellow brothers and sisters, be whatever minority or majority they are. But actually, for me, there's also this economic argument. By 2020, we have a 4.7 million labor market shortage in Europe. We need to have, for our economies, for our welfare state, for the pension, we need to have more and more people coming here. The fact that we see in many parts of Europe the Roma community as a burden, when actually when I think of the Roma community or any other community in a vulnerable situation, I see them as a huge benefit to our communities if we focus on inclusion rather than exclusion. The only people that will get hurt by exclusion is our societies. And that brings me back, and it keeps on reminding me of being back in 1934. I didn't live then, clearly not. But having read a lot about it, having spoken to Holocaust survivors, having spoken to people, from 2 generations back, they look at it and they see what's happening in Europe today. We see in the European Union, we see Brexit, we see how a member state has left the European Union. We see how other member states, Hungary, Poland, are now embarking on illiberal ideas, illiberal regimes. And my question is here, are we in danger? And if so, what are the solutions? How do we counter this populism, extremism? Soraya, your perspective would be representation, the fact that we need to have more people from various backgrounds in parliaments, especially in the European Parliament. But maybe we'll start with you, Mattias. What are the solutions there?
No,
and if I'm wrong, what are the threats we're facing? Please feel free to disagree.
No, I basically agree that in my nightmares, I have this vision. It's like that we're sailing right into the storm. We could see the dark clouds forming at the horizons. We can already sense the wind blowing, and it starts to rain at us. And those people who have bodies that makes it possible for them to pass, they adjust a little bit. So the wind does pass by them. And what they say sort of just add to the strength of the wind. And if you look at, again, history, you're talking about the 1930s, I think it's interesting to look at how such a dynamic, creative, interesting, diverse democracy as the Weimar Republic so smoothly could transform into a National Socialist dictatorship and then back to a democracy again with the same people sitting there. as state employees, as police officers, as professors at the universities, that at each turn consider themselves to be the good and decent citizens. That, I think, is a question that we need to address. Adding to that, of course, that we are sailing in that direction is due to a number of political choices. We can take another number of political choices to avoid sailing into the storm. And I think then we need to talk about inequality, we need to talk about segregation, we need to talk about inclusion, we need to talk about democratizing our democracies instead of undermining constantly the democratic project, which is novel in many respects to modern history. So we need to try to find tools by which to create a more deep democracy with participatory mechanisms that include more people in the democratic processes than what we do today. That's a big challenge. If you look at what we know about those who go and suddenly become inspired by Daesh, the Islamic State, or the Al-Qaeda, we know a lot about them now. It's not a mystery. These are not people who, with the exception of some communities in the UK, but in the rest of Europe, that does not come from the mosques. They are second generation European. They don't really know the Islamic tradition. They take exception from the Islam and of their parent generation, so it's also a generational conflict. But they observe life in these segregated communities. They see the discrepancies between what these countries says they are, you know, the most tolerant countries. Europe is the birth cradle of human rights and equality, and they experience something differently. They have observed how their fathers lost their status, their jobs, their respect, maybe are forced to drive cabs instead of working as engineers, and they opt for joining Daesh, not by instead of going to their parents' countries and fight there, they go to Iraq or Syria, that they might not have any idea of, you know, and they bring out Islam for dummies as they go. We know from the leaked documents from within the Islamic State that out of 22,000 people that joined the Islamic State, their recruits, 70% had no knowledge about Islam. 25% had some knowledge, according to the Islamic State itself, some knowledge about Islam. Only 5% knew sufficient about Islam, you know, and so they react more to the same problems that also feeds fascism and radical nationalism. The Islamic State itself is a radical nationalism. They have the idea that you need to be Muslim in that specific way that they define as the one and only true way of being Muslim. You cannot be Christian, you could not be Shia, you could not be Muslim in any of the million of other ways that people are being Muslim today. They try to monopolize the idea of jihad that is practiced by millions of Muslims just trying to be good and decent human beings, striving to be that, and say that it's about armed struggle and, you know, all of these things. And when they hit inside Europe, when they define Europe as a kuffar continent of the kuffar, they want to establish an anti-Muslim reaction that push more people into their arms. So actually, the fascist anti-Muslim propagandists and the Daesh people agree with each other on that level and feed on each other. And I just completed a study on 200 single-actor terrorist attacks inside Europe since the millennium. And interestingly enough, you could see that not one single attack made by the Islamic State people targeted the radical nationalist, fascist, anti-Muslim groups. And not one single attack made by any anti-Muslim fascist was ever directed against the Islamic State people or the sympathizers to Al-Qaeda. No. They sort of recognize each other. They know that maybe at the end time they will fight each other, but for now they have a basic memorandum of agreement, and they hit the Islamic State. They hit diversity. They go against multiculturalism, which is the same enemy that the fascists go against.
Sorry?
Yes, to your question, what's need to be done? Of course, there is a need for a revitalization of the democracy. And there is, as Alice Bakunke said, we have a lot of freedoms. But I am totally against that we cannot do anything at expression, freedom of expression. I mean, that's not an absolute right. And when we see, when the tendencies grow like it does to the extreme right, we have to make sure that other rights are not put aside because of freedom of expression. I am totally in favor of freedom of expression, but not at any cost at all, because we have seen what they did before, and I'm afraid of that. And of course, I mean, human rights, we have since 1948 developed a lot of conventions, a lot of rights articles, seen as software. And I mean, we are here, we are all saved by human rights who are gathered here tonight. What we have to work on is to make it implemented, not as a software inside the public sphere, into authorities, education on human rights. We have to have a right-based approach inside our authorities and public services. So, and in school curricula, children at kindergarten, they have to grow up with these values. And our democracies has to be founded on these values, not to add whenever it suits. Or like a nice talk, That's not the reality. We have to make human rights articles, conventions, as a living reality. Then I think it is easier to get away, to resist these storms. Yeah.
Morten?
I think we need to get back to the roots of human rights. If I can quote Roosevelt in 1941, where he said we should build a society, the four freedoms: freedom from want and freedom from fear, and then freedom of expression, freedom of religion. But in particular, freedom from want and freedom from fear. I think these two freedoms are very much under pressure from the neoliberal society. And I think in that way, human rights, in a way, will be sort of a moderating factor for the continuation of the neoliberal society as we know it today. What do I mean? I mean that we need to we should be much better in listening to what is it that the electorate of Trump, the Brexit voters, the Marine Le Pen voters, what is it that they say? They have some clear issues. I don't think Trump, Brexit, or Marine Le Pen, may not be surprising to any of you, I don't think they have the solutions. But that doesn't mean that their voters do not have some real issues to cope with that has not been sufficiently addressed. Let me just mention a few. If I'm a 35-year-old truck driver, that's what I can, that's what I'm trained in, that's what I do. I'm listening to my radio in my truck. What do I hear? I hear this happy-go-lucky journalist talking about the chauffeurless cars. It's so great we get these cars that can now drive all by themselves. And then the journalist thinks there must be a problem in this. Oh yeah, there's one problem with insurance. There's an insurance. Now if this truck drives into somebody, what happens then? That's sort of the biggest problem this journalist can find. That's how we hear it every day almost. Nobody talks about the millions of taxi drivers, including the taxi drivers you talked about, but also the truck drivers and all the others. Who takes their concerns serious? Look at the climate change throughout Europe. How many of you are aware of the immense problems that the rural areas in mid and southern European countries are faced? The workers there, the farmers, they are really in big frustration on what on earth are we going to do. They're losing, I mean, just the wine production in Provence is down with 40% this year. That is enormous for the farmers, for the workers there. Who talks about that in any serious manner? But also the fear that is being created of the footage of refugees coming across the Mediterranean and walking up the freeways. We could have handled that much better, but we cannot ignore that it also creates a certain level of fear. So all these different fear drivers, in a way that they converge together with the new technology, converging enormously with a very high speed these days. And very few are actually addressing it. We constantly say, oh, there's a Muslim there. And then we talk about the Muslim or the black person or whatever. Sort of everything is put, all that fear is injected into the face of the other. And as long as politicians are not, and the media are still so feeble in actually addressing some of these very difficult, very complicated issues, but we need to address them, then I'm afraid that the populists, they will have success. But that's again, let me just wind up with one element. One of the lessons learned, because you mentioned the Holocaust and 1934, and I totally agree, I'm enormously afraid of where we are at the moment. And in particular, one element that we should look out for, and that is the erosion of the institutions. The lesson learned from Holocaust is that institutions, laws, protect people. The moment institutions are gone, then there's a free play for the extremist forces. So let's safeguard the courts. Think about how often our national courts are now being attacked. Oh, they are not democratically elected, these judges, and all these expressions. Of course, the EU, Brexit is weakening the EU. The UN is weakened. My own country, Denmark, is now chairing the Council of Europe. What do they have on their agenda? Agenda item number 1 is to weaken the European Court of Human Rights. Is that exactly what we should do these days? No, we should strengthen these institutions. There's a fabulous book written by a historian called Timothy Snyder, who analyzes sort of where were Jews actually best protected during the war, and that is exactly in those countries where you had institutions and laws in place. Even though they were occupied, there was a system of protection. So we need to be careful with how we address the institution and how we can strengthen them in the time to come.
Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think that also we do have a clear vision of what we want as human rights activists and people who believe in human rights. And as civil society and as activists, we maybe have to do a better job at articulating that vision and finding unlikely allies to articulate that together so that people don't feel that their human rights will be lost for someone else to take them. There's enough human rights for everyone, and I think that we can do better at articulating this and working together to strengthen and support each other and raise each other's voices.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes. I wonder, third time luck, if we have any comments from the floor. Nope.
Linda.
So,
Linda.
we do?
Linda.
I can't see anyone.
I can't see anyone.
That's your problem.
Maybe they were raising their hands all the time and nobody saw anything.
Do you want?
So strong
Oh,
spotlight.
I see.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting discussion. I was just wondering if it doesn't work to work for human rights within the EU and the EU starts shaking as the kind of leaders on human rights, then who's going to work for human rights? And the reason I'm asking is because I work in international relations, and I find it more and more difficult to be the kind of good European voice for certain human rights, such as, for example, SRHR, when I often then meet the counter arguments, well, it's just certain human rights and you don't respect the rights, so people fleeing my country, coming to your country, and so on. So I'm wondering if you experience that in your role and if there's a good kind of response to that type.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? We have, no?
I didn't understand.
Okay, so maybe the panelists want to have a response to that. What happens when the EU fails, if I've understood correctly, when the EU fails to uphold certain human rights, who is the guarantee of those human rights? And you say that within the context of picking and choosing different human rights against each other, if I'm correct.
I will try to give a part of the answer, but we can see, I mean, EU has its treaty with articles which should guarantee how the member states should behave. But we have seen, like in Poland, for example, we have seen Hungary as an example for this, and EU is not really prepared towards its member state when they don't follow the treaty. I mean, we did invite Orban to put him in front of us. What he gained that game, because when he went back to Hungary, he said, I put the EU on place. And as well the Polish Prime Minister. So there is an article that was very, very rare to unlock it. So it's difficult. So, but we have the Fundamental Rights Agency. And I think this is what I mean. Human rights should not be something that somebody else makes secure. We have to have it. We have to grow up with this, I think. And of course, the court, as you say, I totally agree, absolutely, because we can also see that in Poland and Hungary and the attacks to the academia. So it's slowly a repetition of what happened before in history at many, there are so many signals. But we have to do it. We as human, we as individuals, we have to get allied and to make sure that our human rights are valued not as soft, as fundamental for our society in the future. And as you said before, there has to be other political alternatives. I don't know if I can say, but Feministiskt initiative do have another alternative.
That's a good plug.
Yeah.
Morten,
more feminism.
No, I think some of us may agree, well, I think all of us should agree to more feminism, but that's probably a bit too political. Morten, you want to have the final say?
No, just, I mean, I think there are clashes of rights, if I heard you right. I mean, and it's always this balancing, and then in the end, I agree with you. I mean, it's up to civil society and others then to deal with it. I just want to end on one, and that is, I mean, coming back to what I said before. I mean, when I started first year in law school, I learned about separation of powers, the courts, the parliament, and the executive, and I haven't talked about it since. The last year, I think I made maybe 10 or 15 speeches about it. I had to find my old law school book out and say, what did I actually learn back then? That has suddenly surfaced again. Is that an indicator of something wrong? That we need to work on it.
So I think what's very clear from this is that if we're not careful, we can and we will go back. And you know, all of the gains we've made since, let's say, the late 40s are at risk of being undermined and being reversed. And you see that in Hungary, in Poland, where you see the attacks on academia, on the judiciary. In the case of Brexit, you see, you know, the attack on the courts when, you know, we wanted to trigger Article 50. And I think these are all worrying signs. But I think the thing we want to stress is that there is a role for activists. there's a role for activists to play with parliamentarians, with academia, with, as in your former position, as director of the Fundamental Rights Agency, that we all have a role to play, and if we stay silent, then who's going to play that role? And I think that's the key thing from this particular debate, that we all need to raise our voices, because it's not the problem of a particular minority, it's a problem of the whole society, because after a particular group targets one community, they target the second community. And then in the end, they target all of our civic freedoms and civil rights. And I think that's the thing that we need to take on board from this discussion. On that note, I would like to thank the panelists, and I will give the floor back to our chief moderator, who's going to close or to introduce a new panel.
Actually, I wanted just to thank you all for a very good, important discussion. Thank you so much.